very much, Nana. I was shortlisted for the King Prize. I didn't win it, so just, correction. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to Sports Club for hosting this. Ndị be anyị ekene m unu. Igbo nọ n'ụlọ na Igbo pụrụ ije unu ga-adị. Ụmụnne m ma mmanụ. I'm also really grateful that my father, Chika, who turned 90 this year, is here. With his brother, my uncle, my other daddy, thank you for being here and supporting me. And all my friends from Anna who happen to be in town and who are also here. Thank you. Professor Kachi Ezigbo, thank you all very much for being here. And your queen, thank you too. My non-Igbo brothers and sisters, greetings, and thank you for having me here today. It's a great honor to be a guest of Nzuko Mibe series, following in the footsteps of other speakers, many of whom I've admired for years, and others whose works I've only recently discovered through Nzuko Mibe. Patrick, Nana, you're doing great work. I'm particularly pleased to be back in Enugu. I was born and raised here. And no matter how long I've been away, every time I return, I feel the air shift, especially for me. I have wonderful memories of growing up in this city. Sadly, some of the places I knew and loved as a child have given way to residential estates, shopping malls, or have fallen into regrettable disuse. Family has always been very important to my parents. And growing up, we would drive with my mother to her village, Lokbanta, in Abia State, every Sunday afternoon to visit my grandparents. Stay long enough to have an early dinner and drive back to Enugu. And twice a year, at Christmas and Afiolo, like many others, we would make the longer drive down, which my father did every weekend, to our ancestral home, Osumeni. I remember the guava-infused scent of those days, the sounds of women greeting each other on their way to a corso, the dust we raised as we ran from masquerades. But most of all, I remember the freedom we took for granted in the way people do when there is little to fear. Trekking the length of the village with my sister Blessing and our co-returnee friends and cousins. So family has always been very important to my parents. And growing up, we would drive with my mother to her village, Lokbanta, in Abia State, every Sunday afternoon to visit my grandparents, stay long enough to have an early dinner, and drive back to Enugu. And twice a year, at Christmas and Afiolo, like many others, we would make the longer drive down, which my father did every weekend, to our ancestral home, Osumeni. I remember the guava-infused scent of those days, the sounds of women greeting each other on their way to a corso, the dust we raised as we ran from masquerades. Most of all, I remember the freedom we took for granted in the way people do when there is little to fear. Trekking the length of the village with my sister Blessing and our co-returnee friends and cousins, riding my chopper or racing my cousin Chukuma on his. And when we became older and able to drive, Blessing and I would pile into a car with my brother or with my cousin driving and head out to nearby Opo or Amichi or Nnewi for some Isiewu or Nchi. Our parents didn't know about these outings. Often my uncle or my dad would have tasked my cousin or my brother with fueling the car, and the four of us would just disappear for many delightful hours, returning to parents upset that an errand of a few minutes had somehow morphed into us being away for far longer. They were upset, but they were never worried. They did not think that we had been kidnapped by some ransom-demanding thugs or attacked by herdsmen. And this wasn't that terribly long ago, relatively speaking. This was in the early 90s, and even then, our parents complained that Nigeria was in a downward spiral, that things were bad, blissfully unaware of the shape of the horrors yet to come, the horrors that are here with us today. Our nation is in a crisis. Alibo especially is in a crisis, and we cannot ostrich our heads in the sand out of it. We can't pretend that the crisis is not urgent when we are confronted with it almost on a daily basis. 3 months ago, the US authorities indicted 80 people for wire fraud and for swindling millions of dollars from US businesses and individuals. 77 are Nigerian, and 74 of the 77 Bundi Igbo. According to Abike Dabiri, of the 21 Nigerians on death row for drug crimes in Indonesia, 20 are from Anambra State. 5 of 5 men arrested for stealing the equivalent of over 220 million naira from a bureau de change in Dubai are young Igbo men. We all remember the 2017 drug-related shooting in Ozobolo Church. In a 2017 interview with the Nigerian Punch, the then president of the Nigerian Union South Africa, Mr. Ikechukwu Anyene, considered to the journalist interviewing him that Ndi Igbo made up the bulk of Nigerians arrested in South Africa on drug-related charges. These men, and sometimes women, the Igbo 419ers, the drug pushers, the robbers, are not invisible. They are not shy about showing off their wealth. And because they crave the attention and adulation that affluence brings, right about this time of the year, almost December, they are getting ready to swarm our villages and towns. They will return from China, Malaysia, and South Africa, and wherever else with ridiculous nicknames and other crass displays of their arrival. Videos will go viral of them in churches thanking Baba God for blessing them. At parties, christening each other with expensive champagne, spraying money, foreign currency like confetti. And we will witness our youth retweet the videos and ask on social media, hey God, when? Not how, but when, which in itself is illustrative. Drug peddlers, 419ers, swindlers, people without a kobo to their names, suddenly catapulting out of nowhere with massive wealth, soiling the nation's reputation. These are the dominant narratives. But we are causing our own pain by contributing to and enabling these narratives to move from the margins to the center. Ndi Igbo as drug peddlers, 419ers, swindlers. These stories are not lies, but they are not representative of our people, and they are certainly not narratives that we should allow to define us as Ndi Igbo. The significant thing about narratives is that they have the power to shape our notions of who we are, and not just what others think of us. The African-American historian and Pan-Africanist J.H. Clark said famously that to control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and your history, he needs no prison walls and no chains to hold you, end of quote. Our ideas of beauty, of race, of civilization, and so on are based on the narratives that were told of us by those with the power to shape and share those narratives. And they, in turn, have become the narratives that we tell ourselves of ourselves. Why would an Igbo child tell another that eating apple is bush, for example? Or that eating with your fingers is bush? Or that speaking Igbo is bush? Why would an Igbo man come on Twitter, as someone did recently, and say what a pity it is that one of our Igbo leaders has an Igbo accent? Why have we accepted that calling an Igbo man Okoro is one of the most terrible insults to hurl at him? It is because over the years, we have allowed, not always willingly I must add, we have allowed others to calibrate what is bush and what is not, what is desirable and what is not. For years, even though our traditional wrapper looks better on full-bodied women, we swallowed the myth that a certain body shape is preferable. Now, with the body positivism movement being championed by full-bodied women in the West, the body shape meant for Imakwa is again being touted as beautiful. The narratives that we have allowed to dominate tell us to look elsewhere, outside of us, for what we ought to find desirable. We do not see the irony in overzealous pastors and their acolytes destroying what should be our World Heritage sites, and preaching a total eradication of our traditional festivals in some cases, going as far sometimes as abandoning or changing their names for being heathenish, but who then live quite happily in a world where days of the week are named after European gods. Like Achebe would say, James Baldwin, the African-American writer, sums up the danger of allowing someone else have control of your narrative when he said that you've got to tell the world how to treat you, because if the world tells you how you're going to be treated, you're in trouble, end of quote. This is why we need to tell our own stories, to begin to reclaim our own narrative, to reassert our values as markers of our Igbo identity, and to push those narratives out. But what are those values? What are our Igbo values? It is said that wisdom is the beginning of knowledge, but I think that's wrong. Knowledge, self-knowledge, is where wisdom really starts. What is Igbo identity? As a storyteller, and as one both interested and invested in words, I look for answers in language. To discover what a people hold dear, their worldview, we look for clues in their language, what words they deploy to say the things they do. So for example, my mother-in-law, who is Belgian, doesn't understand why I say sorry to her for things that are not my fault. Like, boys, that's not your fault. Like, I know, I'm just saying sorry because, it's what we do, I've tried to explain to her that the sorry isn't me accepting personal responsibility for her maybe spilling coffee or stubbing her toe, for example, but rather me acknowledging our shared humanity. Sorry is a very inadequate translation we use for ndo, which encompasses an entire worldview that says, I suffer because you suffer. I empathize with you. No one needs to explain sorry to an Igbo person or to a Nigerian even, because our cultures are collectivist. The English, whose worldview is more individualistic and who claim a man's home is his castle, a proverb which underscores privacy in a way that is alien to our Igbo culture, could not be expected to have a competent translation of ndo, a word that emphasizes interconnectedness in a way that Westerners find difficult to grasp naturally. So using language as our clue, what does it mean to be Igbo? We'll begin with the most important, the essence of what we are called, Madu. In Abriba dialect, the word for man is Onyife, a person of light. In Father Emmanuel Edes towards an Igbo metaphysics, he splits the word Madu into its two components, Madu or Mmadi, the good that is, or let goodness be. We can therefore infer that goodness and light, both of which mean the same thing really, are at the core of being an Igbo human. Since these imply morality, we can also say that morality is an integral part of being Igbo. We say Mmadu bụ chi ibe ya, with the understanding that chi is intrinsically good. When we are overwhelmed with someone's goodness, we say Obuka Mmadu. They are very human. When people deviate from the norm, we begin to use the qualifier Ajo Mmadu or Ezigbo Mmadu to make the distinction from Ajo Mmadu. None of the other two languages I speak has that intrinsic goodness of man embedded in their word for man as to make good redundant. In English, you would never say he's so human, in the same way we would say in Igbo, that's Onya Abuka Mmadu. To fully embody the goodness and light, to fully become Igbo, we must therefore begin to reclaim the cultural values that Igbo have always espoused as markers of Igbo identity. These values, condensed and referred to in a Facebook post by an Igbo group, Odenibo, as the 7 pillars of Igbo republicanism. Igbo Botu, unity. Igwe Bike, cooperation. Onye wele ihe onye ọzọ, thou shalt not steal. Ịgba mbọ, industry. Onye ayala nwanne ya, brotherhood. Ọfọ n'ogu, moral authority and righteousness. Igbo enwe eze, communal leadership based on meritocratic gerontocracy. All these values encourage communality and collective responsibility. I am because you are. What affects one affects us all. And These values were the catalyst for the improvement unions which sprouted all over Igbo land in the 30s and 40s, and which by 1964 had established 38 secondary schools all over Igbo. I am because you are. How have we veered so far from our traditional Igbo values that we have allowed greed and fraud and corruption and conspicuous consumption to identify us? Where did the rain begin to fall on us? So I say, let us search for the beginning of this reign in colonization. And it's impossible for me to trace it to colonization without referencing Achebe's Things Fall Apart, the canonical text of how the clouds for the rains began to gather. In Things Fall Apart, for those who haven't read it, Okonkwo has no respect for his father, Unoka, and not even in death, because Unoka was a lazy man. While other men worked, Okonkwo complains, his father stayed home and drank and played the flute. Unoka's reputation as a lazy man haunts Okonkwo throughout the novel and is the single most important motivation for Okonkwo to sometimes take unpopular decisions. A man who sat at home and twirled his thumb, who could not grow his akonoba because he would not work, was not a man worthy of respect. A man's wealth was often commensurate to how hard he was prepared to work and how blessed he was. The political system in Igbo was communal and collective, at odds when the British came with the British indirect rule system. And so the colonial authorities usurped the system and created Kotumas and warrant chiefs. Arguably, corruption started with the Kotumas who took bribes to influence cases and the quality of their translations, and with the warrant chiefs who did not have traditional authority to rule, but possessed power through the British, who had both the yam and the knife. These warrant chiefs, not immune to the corruption of power, became the new ruling class. The court messengers and the warrant chiefs did not have to work hard on the farm, did not have to toil to become wealthy. For the first time, the wealthiest men did not necessarily have to be the ones who had the bountiest harvests. The currency of respect naturally began to change around this time. Perhaps some might say that I'm reaching, that we had years of relative integrity when hard work, and not necessarily manual labor, hard work and integrity were respected. Years when criminals were not rewarded in Igbo with chieftaincy titles and were not given front row pews in churches. And maybe they're right. Maybe I should seek for the genesis of the rot in the SAP years from the mid-1980s. An old friend of mine writes eloquently in the UK Guardian of his father, a civil servant physician, who bought a new Volkswagen in 1994. No, who bought a new Volkswagen in 1984. The next time his father bought a car, we assume the next time he could afford to buy one, was about 17 years later. A second-hand 1992 model Honda Accord shipped from Europe. Volkswagen of Nigeria, like many other industries, hadn't survived SAP. My friend's story will be familiar to anyone who lived through the fiasco that was SAP. The government's policies completely eroded the middle class and enshrined corruption as a way of life. People who had worked all their lives could no longer count on getting good pensions. And civil servants, people who earned money honestly, could no longer afford the lifestyles that they had been used to. Our universities became desolate. Scholars and intellectualism were discouraged. Politicians and their cronies who had direct access to the government became the new wealthy class. And in Igbo, it helped to create the mess we are still dealing with now. A culture that has always respected wealth because it was taken for granted that a man became wealthy by doing honest work, in this new dispensation seems to be struggling to find ways to accept the wealth but not the bearer of it. We have stopped asking for one source of wealth. But there's no need crying over spilled palm wine. It behooves us to mop up the mess and start again. And how do we do this? How do we begin to redefine and reclaim Igbo values so that corruption, and celebration of illicit wealth are things that are no longer allowed to define us. How do you put the Mma back into Mmadu, the Ife back into Onye Ife? How do we seize back the narrative of Igbo identity to center our core values? On social media, on TV, on the streets, in books, in newspapers, there is no shortage of ways and people who will tell our story should we choose not to tell it. So we must use these same spaces to center narratives that best define us. And I know from personal experience how what we consume, the books we read and the films we watch, affects how we feel about ourselves. Our writers, our creative artists should continue producing works that center the Igbo worldview. In recent years, Chika Obiama's brilliant Orchestra of Minorities and Akweke Emezi's Fresh Water, which center Igbo cosmology in a contemporary world, have done that. Our Igbo Nollywood directors and producers and scriptwriters should tell our Igbo stories that, while not romanticizing Ali Igbo, privilege another sort of narrative to the dominant one. Nnaji's Lionheart set in Enugu is a good example and shows what is possible when intentionality and ownership of the means of production collide. Our Igbo musicians, Fino, Umobilibo, Flavor, and so many others who sing in Igbo, who therefore center our language in parties and at airports around the world, create a sense of pride in our identity, and could take it further by singing lyrics that celebrate the very best of that identity. Ali Igbo should invest in Igbo-centered publishing, Igbo newspapers, for example. Igbo books should be available in our libraries, where these libraries exist, to boost interest in the reading of it. But we must be careful too. I remember reading a book written by an Igbo woman years ago, where the protagonist was said to have done well because Onazi Asu Igbo, Nani Beke Onasu, which is quite a ridiculous thing to see, in a book written in Igbo, celebrating Igbo-ness, that the pinnacle of success is someone who no longer speaks Igbo, but only speaks English. And I think this is the reason why the work really must begin at home, in our homes. Our people say, we need to, in our individual homes, begin to recalibrate markers of success for our children. I remember reading an interview with a Nigerian-British actor, Chiwetale Ejiofor, where he said that a journalist told his mother that she must be really, really proud of her son who was a star. The mother replied that her daughter, who just graduated from a top college, was the star, before saying that she was proud of both of them. Success shouldn't just be about how much one is bringing in, but how one maximizes their talents and gifts to live a life of fulfillment. Where the only marker of success is money, people are tempted to resort to whatever means to make it. Wealth in itself is not bad. After all, we name our children Egodi. Our Igbo culture does not shun wealth. That it was earned honestly was taken as a given. It is the get it by all means wealth that has saturated our communities that we must begin to shun and teach our children to shun as well. Ezia Fakako. Ezia Fakako or Ezia Fakego. It seems to me that our spiritual and community leaders have forgotten these two in this era of money being the be-all and end-all. We're all witnesses to how often these men of dubious characters are given titles in our villages and towns, Eze this and Ichie that. How often they are addressed as prophets and pastors, making a mockery of the positions that they hold. And we are responsible for enabling them by allowing them avenues to legitimize themselves and to whitewash their wealth by building community centers and places of worship. We should be strong enough and bold enough to let them know that Ali Igbo is not in the business of whitewashing money. Our community centers and churches should not be built by one person who has the money to throw around, especially if that money was not earned honestly. And in the past, to the best of my knowledge, these centers were built with communal effort so that everybody felt a sense of ownership. No one person could lay claim to it, and so no one person was above the authority of those places. You can't scold an erring man with his food in your mouth. We need to be intentionally minded about creating more inclusive spaces for cross-sector conversations and supporting those that already exist, like Nkata, and Society of Igbo Professionals. Spaces that task us, not just to palaver, but also to reflect on where we have strayed and discuss ways to get back on the right path. We must tell our own stories, beat our own drums, magnify the achievements of Igbo across the globe by supporting projects like this one, like Chika Igbo blog, Okporo Blogspot, Juliet Kego and Ifi Melodies Eku Igbo on Twitter, Yvonne Mbanefos and Luisa Ibunike's Igbo Conference, Golibe Festival, and also by creating more spaces like this for centering Igbo culture, celebrating Igbo excellence, profiling alternative role models for our youth. We should work at owning the means of production so that we are better able to disseminate the narratives we choose to. Even as we join a globalizing world, we should not lose sight of our own local traditions. We should watch against diluting our Iliji and Afiolu so much that they lose their significance. Those of us in the positions to do so should encourage our ministries of culture, education, and information to pick up the mantle and join in the fight for reclaiming and owning our narratives as they had in the past. For example, Avenue Ikoku College of Education had the magazine Igbo Gadi, completely written in Igbo. And from 1979 to 1986, Imo State had the excellent Anu, a magazine on Igbo culture, whose main purpose, according to its editorial, was to recover, document, analyze, and give information about Igbo culture. And to our shame, of the 12 libraries who have copies of this magazine still available, 11 are in the United States, and the 12th is at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. There is none in Nigeria. Ndị be anyị sị na alụ gbaro bụla omenani. We've allowed these narratives to take root. Manata Bubo. Let us begin now to mezi ala Igbo. Thank you all for being patient and listening.